Houston, Texas. April 28, 1967. A room full of military officers, 26 men in uniforms sitting in rows with clipboards and forms stacked in front of them, waits for one name to be called, and the most famous athlete in the world is about to walk through that door knowing he'll lose everything he's ever worked for by doing nothing more than standing perfectly still. Room 3A sits on the 4th floor of the Custom House building, and when Muhammad Ali walks in wearing a black suit and bow tie, just 25 years old but already heavyweight champion of the world and worth millions, the fluorescent lights buzz overhead and the room carries that unmistakable government building smell of floor wax and paper and tension. The 26 military officers don't look at him even though everyone in America knows who he is, and outside in the hallway reporters crowd against the door with cameras and microphones while flash bulbs pop, but inside there's only silence. An officer stands at the podium and starts reading names, and one by one young men step forward to sign the forms that will decide their futures with a single signature. Some hesitate for a moment, one kid's hand even shakes as he signs, but they all step forward eventually. Then the officer's voice cuts through the quiet, Cassius Marcellus Clay. Ali doesn't move, and the officer looks up from his clipboard and repeats louder this time, Cassius Marcellus Clay, step forward for induction, but Ali's feet stay planted on the floor while his jaw remains set and his eyes look straight ahead at nothing and everything at the same time. 5 seconds pass that feel like 5 hours, and the room holds its breath because everyone in that space knows exactly what this moment means. The officer's voice grows louder and more insistent, Cassius Marcellus Clay, this is your final call to step forward. Nothing happens. Ali doesn't speak or explain or move a muscle, and the officer makes a note on his clipboard, just one word that will echo through history, refused. The pen scratches against paper in the silence, and what just happened in those 5 seconds doesn't just cost Ali his title but changes the civil rights movement and the anti-war movement and American history itself. But here's what nobody in that room knows, this moment actually started 3 years earlier in a different room, when a young boxer made a decision that would inevitably lead him to this exact spot. Miami, February 1964. 22-year-old Cassius Clay had just shocked the world by beating Sonny Liston to become heavyweight champion, and the press conference afterward was pure chaos with reporters everywhere shouting questions. Someone asked about the rumors, about religion, about the Nation of Islam, and Clay looked directly at the cameras and said 5 words that changed everything, I am a Muslim now. The room went silent because this wasn't just about being Muslim, it was about the Nation of Islam, and in 1964 America that wasn't just controversial, it was dangerous. Malcolm X stood in the back of the room smiling because they'd been meeting in secret for months, reading together and talking about what it meant to be black in America, and Clay continued speaking, Cassius Clay is a slave name. I am Muhammad Ali. White America exploded with editorial after editorial calling him a traitor and a disgrace and un-American, and FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover opened a file that same day while surveillance began immediately. But Ali finally had something that Cassius never had, his own name, his own identity, his own truth, though he didn't know yet that standing for that truth would eventually cost him everything. By 1966 the war in Vietnam had escalated dramatically with body bags coming home every week, and the government needed more soldiers so the draft board started calling more names, including Muhammad Ali's. His draft classification suddenly changed from 1Y, which meant unfit due to low test scores, to 1A, ready for service, which meant the man who had failed the Army intelligence test was now somehow smart enough to die in a jungle. When a reporter asked Ali about Vietnam, he said what everyone was thinking but nobody dared to say out loud, I ain't got no quarrel with them Viet Cong. No Viet Cong ever called me an *************. Those 26 words made the entire country lose its mind because here was a black champion refusing to fight communism and refusing to be patriotic and refusing to do his duty. But Ali saw something they refused to see. Black men were being sent to fight for freedom abroad while being denied that same freedom at home, and in Louisville, his hometown, black people still couldn't eat at certain restaurants or use certain bathrooms or vote without facing intimidation. The pressure started building from every direction imaginable. Boxing commissions warned him to comply or lose his license, promoters warned him to comply or lose his fights, and lawyers warned him to comply or face 5 years in federal prison. His mother called crying, begging him to just go and do paperwork because he wouldn't have to see combat, and his friends said the same thing because even other black athletes like Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson had served their time. But Muhammad Ali wasn't Joe Louis, and he wasn't playing their game anymore. The night before the induction, April 27, 1967, Ali couldn't sleep because his lawyer had explained everything with painful clarity. Refuse induction tomorrow and you lose everything, your title will be stripped immediately, your boxing license will be revoked in all 50 states, you'll face criminal charges and prison time and millions in lost earnings. Everything he'd worked for since he was 12 years old training in a Louisville gym would be gone in an instant. His wife Belinda sat with him and said softly, "You don't have to do this," but Ali looked at her and replied, "Yes, I do," because somewhere in the previous 3 years boxing had stopped being the most important thing in his life and the belt had stopped mattering as much as the man wearing it. He thought about the young black men who were watching him and what message he'd be sending if he stepped forward, and he thought about his faith and about Allah and about standing before God one day and having to explain why he obeyed the government instead of his conscience. He thought about his name, Muhammad Ali, the name he'd fought for and claimed as his own, and asked himself if he deserved that name if he stepped forward tomorrow. By the time morning came, Ali had his answer. Back in that room in Houston at 8:03 a.m., the officer was growing increasingly frustrated as he said, "Mr. Clay, this is your final opportunity," but Ali's voice came out quiet and clear, "I'm sorry, but I can't do that." 7 words, and then the officer wrote 1 word in response, "refused," before Ali signed a written statement with a steady hand that showed no shaking or hesitation whatsoever. Then he walked out into complete chaos as reporters swarmed him with microphones thrust in his face, all of them shouting, "Why?" and, "Are you afraid?" and, "What about America?" Ali stopped on the steps with the morning sun bright in his eyes and said calmly, "I refuse to be inducted into the armed forces of the United States because I claim to be exempt as a minister of the religion of Islam," and then he simply walked to his car and drove away. He had no idea that within 1 hour every boxing commission in America would strip his title, or that the FBI would start tapping his phones the very next day, or that death threats would come daily, or that he wouldn't fight again for 43 months. All he knew in that moment was that his conscience was clear, and sometimes that's the only thing a man can actually control. The consequences came like an avalanche that couldn't be stopped. That same afternoon the New York State Athletic Commission stripped his title and other states followed within hours, with the World Boxing Association and World Boxing Council both declaring the title vacated, which meant Muhammad Ali, undefeated heavyweight champion of the world, no longer had a belt. On May 8 came the federal indictment in United States vs. Clay, with maximum penalties of 5 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, and by June 20 the trial was over in just 1 day with the jury deliberating for only 21 minutes before returning a guilty verdict and the judge handing down the maximum sentence of 5 years. No state would give him a boxing license after that, which meant he couldn't fight or train publicly or earn money from the only thing he'd ever known how to do, and at 25 years old in his absolute prime, those crucial years when a heavyweight champion makes both his fortune and his legacy, all of that was simply gone. Later they'd calculate what he gave up, approximately $10 million in earnings, which translates to roughly $90 million in today's money, but it was so much more than money because it was time, and every athlete knows that those years never come back because your reflexes peak and then fade, your speed disappears, and Ali was losing his entire peak to a principle. Friends deserted him because it was too dangerous to be associated with him, career suicide really, and white America hated him with a passion, calling him a coward and a traitor while editorial boards demanded he be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But something else was happening simultaneously because young people, both black and white, started listening to what he was saying, and college campuses invited him to speak until he became a living symbol of resistance and of standing for something even when standing costs you everything. He traveled around the country giving speeches for $1,000 here and $2,000 there, which was barely enough to live on and nothing like the millions he'd be making in the ring, and at night he trained alone in empty gyms, hoping against hope that someday he might fight again. Years passed, 1968, then 1969, then 1970, and his case worked its way through the courts with endless appeals and briefs and arguments while the government tried to make an example of him to show the entire country what happens when you defy the draft. But Ali never broke, never said, "I made a mistake," never stepped forward to apologize. He just stood still exactly like he did in that Houston room while the storm raged all around him. On June 28, 1971, 4 years after that morning in Houston, the Supreme Court of the United States voted unanimously with 8 justices, one had recused himself, to overturn Ali's conviction because the government's case had been fundamentally flawed and his conscientious objector status should have been granted from the beginning. Ali was vindicated, but those 4 years from age 25 to 29, those irreplaceable prime years, were gone forever and would never come back. Before the Supreme Court ruling, in October 1970, Georgia had finally licensed him because they wanted black dollars more than they wanted to punish black defiance, and Ali fought Jerry Quarry and stopped him in the 3rd round after 43 months away from the ring. He was back, but he was different now, slower than before, his reflexes not quite as sharp, his speed not quite as blinding, and the price of principle was written directly on his body. In March 1971 at Madison Square Garden, Ali fought Joe Frazier in what they called the fight of the century, and he lost for the first time in his entire career. He'd come back eventually and win the title again, twice actually, and invent the rope-a-dope strategy and beat George Foreman in Zaire and beat Frazier again in Manila, but he'd never be quite the same fighter who walked into that Houston room because that fighter was gone forever, replaced by a man who had become something far more important than just a fighter. Years later when a reporter asked him directly, "Do you regret refusing the draft?" Ali didn't hesitate for even a second before saying, "Not for 1 second. I wouldn't change a thing." The reporter pushed back, "But you lost your title, lost millions of dollars, lost your prime years as an athlete," and Ali smiled that same smile from his younger days but now with so much more wisdom behind it as he said, "I didn't lose nothing, I gained everything. I gained my soul, my principles, my name, my respect for myself, and millions of young people, black and white, respected me for it, and that's worth more than all the money and belts in the entire world." The U.S. government eventually admitted that Vietnam was a mistake and apologized for it and even built memorials to those who refused to serve, and Muhammad Ali became one of the most beloved figures in American history. In 1996 at the Olympics, the entire world watched his trembling hands. Parkinson's disease was ravaging his body by then, as he lit the Olympic torch and people wept openly. The same government that had prosecuted him gave him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the same boxing commissions that stripped his title enshrined him as the greatest of all time, and the same country that called him a traitor eventually called him a hero, because time has this way of revealing who actually stood on the right side of history. And Ali had stood still while history moved around him and eventually caught up to where he'd been standing all along. That room in Houston still exists today at the Custom House building on 701, San Jacinto Street on the 4th floor in room 3A, and you can visit it if you want to because the fluorescent lights probably still buzz and the floors probably still smell like wax, but the world outside those walls is completely different now, and it's different because one man refused to step forward when his name was called. Here's what they don't teach you about courage. It doesn't always look brave in the moment because sometimes it looks like a 25-year-old man standing perfectly still and silent while his entire world collapses around him, and sometimes it looks like losing everything the world values and calling it freedom, and sometimes it looks like 5 seconds that cost millions of dollars but earned immortality. That morning in April 1967, 25 other men stepped forward in that room and signed those forms, and I don't know their names and you don't know their names and history doesn't know their names either. But everyone knows the name of the man who stood still. Muhammad Ali. Not because he was the strongest fighter or because he won every battle, but because when the moment came and everything was on the line, he chose his soul over safety and his truth over comfort and his name over their approval, and sometimes that's what greatness actually looks like, not the winning but the standing still when everyone else is stepping forward. So here's the question for you, what would you refuse to step forward for? What principle would you trade everything to keep? Because somewhere right now there's a room and your name is being called, and you have a choice to either step forward and keep what you have, or stand still and keep who you are. Muhammad Ali made his choice in 5 seconds. How long will yours take?